They would say later that she had commanded the mountain. They would speak in hushed tones of the woman who arrived with the dust and departed with the silence, the civilian who had stared down a major, a siege, and the very bedrock of the world, and made all three bend to her will. Before she became a legend whispered in the deep earth listening posts, she was just an anomaly, a quiet geophysicist in a place of loud men. He grabbed her wrist to assert his authority, a final, desperate act of a dying hierarchy. "Hands off," she said, and the world changed. He let go, not because of the words, but because of the sudden, chilling certainty that he was no longer in command of anything at all. This is the story of how that certainty was born, in the belly of a dying mountain, under the weight of an impossible war. The air in the Karst 7 forward operating base was a composite fluid, thick with the scent of recycled oxygen, ozone from the server stacks, and the faint, pervasive mineral tang of the billion tons of granite that entombed them. It was a pressure cooker, both literally and metaphorically. Buried 300 meters beneath the jagged peaks of the Aksai Chin, the base was a marvel of military engineering and a monument to paranoia. It existed to listen, its forest of antennas, disguised on the surface as weather-beaten rock formations, drank in signals from the contested valley below, while its deep-core seismic sensors felt the subtle tremors of enemy convoys miles away. The silence within its hardened walls was a manufactured thing, a low hum of life support and data processing that was more profound than any natural quiet. It was a silence that felt like a coiled thing, waiting. Dr. Eris Thorne felt the coil in the resonance of the floor plates beneath her boots. To others, it was just the thrum of the base's generators, a constant vibration that faded into the background of consciousness. To her, it was a complex language. She could distinguish the rhythmic signature of the primary fusion core from the higher frequency chatter of the environmental control systems. She could feel the subtle shifts in load as the deep radar arrays cycled through their power-intensive sweeps. More importantly, she could feel the mountain itself. The granite was not inert. It was a living medium groaning under immense tectonic stress, crisscrossed by hairline fractures and ancient, water-carved voids. She had spent the last 3 weeks mapping its voice, planting her custom-built geophones in forgotten service tunnels and unlit crawl spaces, creating a 3-dimensional acoustic model of the entire massif in her mind. The model was a thing of terrible beauty, a cathedral of stresses and fault lines, silent and perfect. She sat before a temporary workstation tucked into an alcove of the command center, an island of quiet intensity amidst the controlled chaos. Her 3 monitors displayed not tactical overlays or troop movements, but flowing multicolored streams of data that resembled abstract art. One showed a spectrogram of the ambient seismic noise, a river of blues and greens. Another displayed a vector field map of subsurface pressures, a spiderweb of delicate red and yellow lines. The third was raw numerical output, scrolling endlessly. Her fingers moved with economical grace across the keyboard, not typing words, but conducting an orchestra of algorithms. She was looking for patterns, for the subtle dissonances that preceded a collapse. The mountain was old and brittle, and the constant, low-level vibrations from the base's own machinery were slowly, inexorably weakening its integrity. Karst 7 was a ship sinking in slow motion, and only she was watching the waterline. Her appearance was a study in deliberate unobtrusiveness. She wore simple gray fatigues, devoid of rank or insignia, and her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, practical knot. She was of average height and build, with a face that was more focused than memorable. She did not engage in the easy camaraderie of the soldiers, did not join their mess hall conversations or their cynical jokes. She worked, she analyzed, and she listened to the stone. The crew had come to regard her as part of the machinery, another humming, inscrutable black box that performed some function deemed necessary by a command structure far beyond their pay grade. They gave her a wide berth, a mixture of professional respect for her perceived expertise and a faint unease at her detachment. She was the ghost in their machine. The command center itself was a cavern of muted light and quiet tension. Screens lined the curved walls, displaying topographical maps, drone feeds, and encrypted communications traffic. Men and women in uniform moved with practiced efficiency, their voices low and clipped. It was the nerve center of a silent war, a war of intercepts and analysis. And at its heart, on a raised dais, sat Major Valerius. He was the antithesis of the base's quiet professionalism. Valerius was a man forged in the crucible of conventional warfare, a man who understood the world in terms of armor plating, muzzle velocity, and kill ratios. He was built like a battering ram, with a barrel chest and a face that seemed permanently flushed with indignation. His voice was a blunt instrument, designed to hammer home his authority. He paced the dais like a caged bear, his presence a constant disruptive energy field in the otherwise calm room. He despised Karst 7. He saw it as a coward's fortress, a place for technicians and spies, not warriors. He had been assigned here after a public and costly tactical error in a previous theater, and he viewed the command as a punishment, an insult to his martial pride. He trusted steel, not data. He believed in overwhelming force, not subtle influence. And he particularly distrusted Dr. Eris Thorne. She represented everything he found contemptible about this new way of war, the reliance on academics, on invisible forces and incomprehensible algorithms. She was a civilian, a woman, and she operated with an unnerving autonomy that grated on his rigid conception of the chain of command. He saw her quiet work in the corner as a waste of resources and a personal affront, a silent judgment on his own obsolescence. The friction between them had been a low hum, like the base itself, for weeks. He would make loud, pointed comments about ivory tower theorists and the need for real soldiers during his daily briefings. He would demand reports from her in arcane military formats she had to have translated, a petty exercise in bureaucratic harassment. She, in turn, ignored him with a placidity that he found even more infuriating. She would deliver the requested data, formatted perfectly, without comment or complaint, her face a mask of neutral efficiency. Her refusal to be baited, to even acknowledge his hostility, felt like the ultimate dismissal. She did not fear him, and for a man like Valerius, to be unfelt was to be powerless. The stage was set, the characters were in place, the mountain held its breath. The confrontation, when it came, was as sudden and jarring as a fault line shearing. It happened during the midday shift change, the time of maximum occupancy in the command center. Valerius was delivering his briefing from the dais, his voice booming with manufactured confidence as he outlined patrol routes and surveillance priorities for the coming cycle. He was in his element, the center of attention, the undisputed master of his domain. He spoke of enemy chatter and potential ground incursions, the familiar language of the wars he understood. Then he stopped mid-sentence. His eyes, sweeping the room for effect, landed on Thorne's alcove. She was not looking at him. She was leaning forward, her attention fixed on her central monitor, where the river of blue and green had begun to show a thin, anomalous thread of crimson. A new sound had entered the mountain's vocabulary, a frequency so low it was felt more than heard, a faint, rhythmic pulse that was utterly alien to the station's normal sonic signature. It was unnatural. It was intentional. Valerius saw her focus as a personal slight. In his world, when the commander spoke, everyone listened. Her absorption in her own work was a public act of insubordination. He decided, in that moment, to make an example of her, to reassert the primacy of rank over esoteric science. He descended from the dais, his boots clanging on the metal steps, the sound echoing in the sudden silence of the room. Every eye followed him. The briefing had stopped. A new kind of theater had begun. He strode to her workstation and stood over her, casting a large shadow across her screens. "Dr. Thorne," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "While the rest of us are focused on the defense of this installation, you seem to be preoccupied. Is your geology project more critical than the operational readiness of this base?" Thorne did not look up. Her eyes remained locked on the screen, tracing the propagation of the crimson thread. It was a structured signal, not random noise. It repeated in a complex, non-random pattern. It was a code written in the language of seismic waves. She made a minute adjustment to a filter, and the signal sharpened. It was emanating from outside the base, from multiple points arranged in a perfect geometric pattern. They were surrounding them. "Doctor," Valerius's voice hardened, the feigned politeness evaporating. "I asked you a question. Protocol demands you address your commanding officer when spoken to." Without turning, Thorne spoke, her voice calm and devoid of inflection, yet it cut through the room's tension like a scalpel. "Major, your operational readiness is what I am currently analyzing. There is an external, low-frequency acoustic transmission targeting this facility. Multiple emitters, Class 4 seismic drivers at minimum. They are not talking, they are pushing." The technical jargon was a red flag to Valerius. It was her language, not his, another layer of what he perceived as deliberate obfuscation. "Pushing? What is that supposed to mean? Speak English, Doctor. Are we under attack?" He scoffed, the last words heavy with sarcasm, as if the very idea of an attack she could detect before his sensors did was absurd. "Not in a way your systems are designed to recognize," she replied, finally turning her head to look at him. Her eyes were clear and steady, analytical instruments taking his measure. "They are not using explosives. They are using resonance. They are attempting to induce lithospheric stress failure. They are trying to collapse the mountain on top of us." A murmur rippled through the command center. The operators and technicians exchanged uneasy glances. The concept was terrifying, something out of science fiction. But Thorne's absolute certainty was unsettling. Sergeant Eva Rostova, the head of the sensor analysis team, leaned forward at her own console, her expression tight with concentration. She respected Thorne. She had seen the meticulousness of her work, the almost preternatural accuracy of her minor predictions about equipment vibration and structural settling over the past weeks. Valerius, however, saw only a challenge to his authority. He laughed, a short, barking sound of disbelief. "Collapse the mountain? With sound waves? That is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard. This is a military installation, Doctor, not a fantasy novel. We are being probed by conventional electronic warfare, My teams will handle it. He gestured dismissively at her screens. Shut down this nonsense and stop distracting my personnel with your ghost stories. Thorne's gaze did not waver. She did not argue or raise her voice. She simply stated a fact. Major, you are misinterpreting the threat. Your electronic warfare suites are looking for radio frequencies. This is acoustic, physical. By the time your ground sensors register the shear stress as a geological event, it will be too late. The primary shear plane is less than 50 meters above the reactor housing. Based on the energy they are inputting into the system, I estimate we have 17 minutes until critical structural failure begins. 17 minutes. The specificity of the number hung in the air, cold and sharp. It was not a guess. It was a calculation. For a moment, Valerius was speechless, his face purpling with rage. She had not only contradicted him, she had publicly presented a timeline that made his own assessments seem incompetent and slow. She had drawn a line in the sand, and the entire command staff was watching to see which side of it he stood on. His training, his ego, his entire worldview could not accommodate this. He saw it as a power play, an attempt by a civilian academic to usurp his command in a moment of perceived crisis. He would crush it. He would reestablish the order of things. He pointed a thick finger at her console's power strip. I am giving you a direct order, Doctor. Shut it down now, or I will have you escorted to the brig for insubordination. Thorne simply turned back to her screen. She had presented the data. The conclusion was self-evident. The Major's failure to comprehend it did not alter its reality. Her dismissal was the final spark. It was more than insubordination. It was a declaration that his authority was irrelevant in the face of the facts. He had been nullified, and he could not tolerate it. The first tremor hit precisely 1 minute later. It was not a violent earthquake, not a sudden jolt. It was a deep, sickening lurch, a fluid motion of the entire base, as if the solid rock had momentarily turned to liquid. A low groan echoed through the structure, the sound of steel support beams protesting a strain they were never designed to bear. Dust sifted from the ceiling panels, and a single monitor on the far wall flickered and died. Panic, cold and sharp, flashed across the faces in the command center. Training took over for most. Hands flew to consoles, voices began calling out damage reports. But the fear was real. The fortress was no longer inviolable. The mountain was moving. Major Valerius was thrown off balance, stumbling a step. For a heartbeat, his face was a mask of pure shock, the bluster stripped away to reveal a raw, primal fear. Then his training reasserted itself, but it was the wrong training for this crisis. He began shouting orders, the familiar litany of a commander under conventional attack. Damage control teams, report. Seal all sectors. Bring secondary power online. I want a perimeter sweep. Find the point of impact. His commands were useless. There was no point of impact. The attack was everywhere at once. It was the ground itself, their foundation, that had become the enemy. His voice, usually a tool of absolute control, was now just noise, adding to the growing chaos. The operators tried to follow his orders, but their systems were failing. The vibration was playing hell with the delicate electronics. Screens blinked erratically. Data streams corrupted into gibberish. The base's internal comms crackled with static and panicked voices from other sectors. "Sir, we're losing contact with the lower levels," someone shouted. "The main comms array is offline. The surface mast is reporting severe oscillation," called another. Sergeant Rostova's voice cut through the noise, tight with control. "Major, All external seismic sensors are redlining. It's not an impact, it's a resonance event. Frequency is 7.2 hertz and building. Thorne was right. Valerius ignored her, his mind trapped in a tactical loop that no longer applied. Get me air support. I want to strike on all suspected enemy positions in the valley. Grid coordinates Alpha 7 through Delta 4. Saturation bombing. Now, he roared into his command headset, directing his fury at a distant, unhearing chain of command. He was trying to solve a physics problem with explosives, like a man trying to put out a fire by shooting at it. The failure of his orthodoxy was absolute and terrifyingly swift. His tools were useless. His experience was a liability. His authority was a hollow shell. Amidst the rising tide of chaos, Eris Thorne was an island of pure calm. The lurch of the station had not surprised her. Her models had predicted it. The failing systems were an expected consequence of the harmonic vibrations. While Valerius bellowed useless commands, she was working. Her fingers flew across her keyboard, her movements economical and precise. The initial tremor had given her a wealth of new data, a clear picture of the mountain's response to the enemy's acoustic pressure. She could now see the fracture lines widening in real time, the stress concentrating around the weakest points. Her model updated, the timeline shortened. 17 minutes was now 9. She saw the solution. It was elegant, brutal, and symmetrical. The enemy was using a brute force application of acoustic energy, a sledgehammer against the mountain. They were powerful, but crude. They didn't understand the complex internal structure of the massif, the delicate lacework of faults and voids. They were pushing on the whole structure, hoping for a general collapse. But she had the map. She knew the secret chords. She could use a far more precise frequency, a harmonic scalpel, to target a single, catastrophically unstable feature. A massive overhanging rock shelf on the north face, directly above the valley where the enemy emitters had to be located. She wouldn't just try to survive their attack. She would use their own energy, amplify it, and retune it to bring 1,000,000 tons of rock down on their heads. She would not just counter their weapon, she would turn the entire mountain into one. A second, more violent tremor shook the base. This time, it was a sharp, vertical drop, followed by a vicious sideways shear. A section of the ceiling panels tore loose, raining down cables and insulation. The lights flickered violently, then went out, plunging the command center into the terrifying red glow of emergency lighting. The main power grid was failing. The red light cast long, dancing shadows, turning the panicked faces into demonic masks. Valerius, his face slick with sweat, finally seemed to understand that his orders were meaningless. He turned, his eyes wild, and saw Thorne still working, her face illuminated by the glow of her screens, which were running on their own uninterruptible power supply. She was his focal point for failure, the source of this incomprehensible nightmare. If he could stop her, he could somehow stop what was happening. He lurched towards her alcove. "I gave you an order," he screamed, his voice cracking with fear and rage. "You did this. Your damn machines brought this on us." Thorne ignored him. She was finalizing the frequency calculations. The operation would require a massive power draw, a single focused pulse channeled through the base's own seismic calibration emitters, devices designed for subtle mapping, not for geological warfare. She would have to bypass every safety protocol, rerouting all remaining power from the secondary generators directly to the emitters. She stood up and turned towards the main power distribution panel on the far wall. That was when he reached her. As she moved past him, he grabbed her wrist, his grip like a manacle. It was a primal, physical assertion of dominance, the last resort of a man whose authority had evaporated. The contact was a jarring intrusion into her world of dispassionate analysis. "You are not touching anything. You will stand down," he snarled, his face inches from hers. The entire room fell silent. The shouts and panicked reports died away. All that remained was the groaning of the mountain and the harsh, ragged breathing of the major. Every person left in the command center turned to watch the final confrontation. Thorne looked down at the thick fingers wrapped around her arm. She did not struggle. She did not show fear. She simply looked back up at him, her eyes as cold and hard as the granite that surrounded them. "Hands off," she said. The words were spoken quietly, almost conversationally. There was no anger, no panic, no pleading. It was a simple statement of fact, an instruction. It carried the weight of absolute, unshakable certainty. In that moment, the hierarchy of the room inverted. He was the one who was hysterical, flailing, and out of control. She was the one who was calm, focused, and in command. He let go. He let go fast. It was an involuntary reaction, as if he had touched a high-voltage line. He recoiled, his hand dropping to his side, a look of stunned confusion on his face. He had expected a struggle, fear, compliance. He had not expected to be so utterly and completely dismissed. He had lost. Thorne did not spare him another glance. Authority had not been seized. It had simply flowed to her, the only point of stability in a collapsing world. She turned and walked towards the power distribution panel. As she did, she spoke, her voice now amplified by the room's sudden, rapt attention. It was calm, precise, and resonant with purpose. "Sergeant Rostova," she said, not looking back, "I need you to bypass the primary power cutoffs and slave the secondary generator output to my workstation. I will need a full system dump on my mark, channeled directly to the 4 primary seismic emitters. Override all safety interlocks." For a half-second, Rostova hesitated, her gaze flicking from Thorne to the slack-jawed major. It was a direct contradiction of a standing command structure. It was mutiny. But she had seen Valerius's failure, and she had heard the undeniable truth in Thorne's analysis. She saw the only path to survival. Her choice was clear. "Yes, ma'am," Rostova said, her voice firm. The ma'am was a subtle but profound shift. It was a recognition of a new, unofficial chain of command, one based not on rank, but on competence. She turned to her own team. "You heard her! Make it happen! Now!" Her crew, who trusted their sergeant implicitly, did not hesitate. They sprang into action, their movements now filled with a desperate purpose that had been absent under Valerius's chaotic reign. Keyboards clattered as they broke through layers of digital security protocols. They were no longer following the major's orders. They were following the quiet physicist. The rest of the command center staff watched, frozen, as the coup unfolded. Valerius stood alone on the dais, a king deposed, watching his kingdom being dismantled to serve a purpose he could not comprehend. Thorne reached the main power panel. She pulled open the heavy steel door, revealing a dense web of thick cables and breakers. She didn't need a schematic. She had studied the base's engineering plans as part of her initial geological survey. Her hands moved with an electrician's certainty, pulling a specific sequence of heavy levers, rerouting the flow of energy with loud, definitive clunks that echoed in the silent room. A new, deeper hum began to build, the sound of the secondary generators spooling up to maximum output, Their power no longer diffused across the base's life support and lighting, but concentrated, focused, waiting for her command. She walked back to her station, the low red light glinting off the surfaces of her monitors. The enemy frequency was still hammering at them, the 7.2 hertz pulse, a relentless heartbeat of destruction. Another tremor shook the room, longer and more violent this time. A hairline crack zigzagged across the far wall. The groaning of the tortured metal became a high-pitched scream. Her timeline had shrunk to less than 3 minutes. She sat down and placed her hands on the keyboard. Her screen now showed a new display, a representation of the mountain, with the enemy emitters as pulsing red dots at its base, and the massive, unstable rock shelf on the north face, highlighted in yellow. Below it was a frequency modulation graph, a single, sharp spike that she could manipulate with her controls. This was her weapon. "Rostova, confirm the channel is open," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the storm. "Channel is open," Rostova's voice came back, strained but steady. "All secondary power is routed to the emitters, standing by for your release. All safeties are bypassed. We're burning the generators out doing this, ma'am. This is a one-shot deal." "One is all I will need," Thorne replied. She looked at her seismic data feeds. The enemy was pouring more and more energy into the mountain, sensing its imminent collapse. They were growing impatient. It was a fatal mistake. They were providing her with all the raw power she needed. Her job was not to create the wave, but merely to shape it, to catch their clumsy tsunami of force and refocus it into a single, perfect point. She began the process. It was less like operating a weapon and more like tuning a delicate instrument. She introduced her own frequency into the system, a subtle, high harmonic carrier wave. On her screen, a thin blue line appeared, weaving itself into the broader red band of the enemy's assault. She was not fighting their resonance. She was joining it. She was harmonizing with it. She listened with her sensors, feeling for the mountain's response. The structure shuddered, a new vibration layering over the old one. The groans of the metal changed pitch, becoming higher, more stressed. She adjusted the frequency by 1/100th of a hertz. The feedback on her screen changed. The blue line brightened. She was getting closer. The enemy was using a constant frequency. She was using a dynamic one, constantly adjusting, listening to the rock, finding the precise note that would make it sing. It was a deadly duet. "Phase lock initiated," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Building the cascade, she began to feed power into the system, a gentle trickle at first, then a steady stream. The hum in the room deepened, the floor vibrating with a new, more powerful rhythm. The lights, already on emergency backup, dimmed further as the generators strained. On her screen, the yellow highlight of the target rock shelf began to pulse, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. She was feeding the vibration directly into the fault lines beneath it, turning the enemy's chaotic energy into a focused battering ram. The mountain screamed. It was no longer a groan, but a continuous, high-frequency shriek of rock crystals fracturing under unbearable pressure. Everyone in the room braced themselves, their hands gripping consoles, their faces pale in the crimson gloom. They were inside the hammer now, feeling the blow that was about to fall. Valerius had sunk to his knees on the dais, his head in his hands, a man broken by a reality he refused to accept. Thorne's face was serene, a mask of pure concentration. Her eyes tracked a dozen variables at once: stress vectors, shear velocity, energy absorption. The numbers were converging on a perfect point, The rock shelf was saturated with harmonic energy. It was a bomb, waiting for the final detonator. "Rostova," she said, her voice clear and absolute. "Full power, now!" "Executing!" Rostova yelled, slamming her fist down on a key. The world dissolved into pure, violent sound. A deafening roar erupted from the very bones of the earth, a sound so immense it transcended hearing and became a physical force that crushed the air from their lungs. The bass dropped, a free fall of several feet that threw people from their chairs. The lights went out completely, leaving only the hellish red glow of Thorne's monitors. For a terrifying, eternal second, the structure felt like it was coming apart, that her gamble had failed, and she had doomed them all. Then, as suddenly as it began, the shaking stopped. The roar from within the mountain ceased, replaced by a distant, fading rumble from the world above. The violent, structured 7.2 hertz vibration was gone, vanished. The only remaining tremor was the gentle, chaotic aftershock of a massive geological event, the settling of a landscape that had been irrevocably altered. A profound silence descended upon the command center. It was a silence deeper and more complete than any they had ever known. The constant hum of the bass was gone, the secondary generators having burned themselves out in their final, glorious surge. The groaning of the metal had ceased. The mountain was quiet. It was the silence of a battle ended, of a fever broken. For a long moment, no one moved. They were suspended in the red darkness, absorbing the reality of their survival. They were alive. The attack was over. Slowly, as backup battery power kicked in, the main lights flickered back on, one by one, their harsh white glare chasing the red shadows from the room. The scene they illuminated was one of minor devastation. Fallen panels, cracked screens, scattered papers, but the structure was intact. They had held. Every eye in the room turned to the woman in the alcove. Eris Thorne sat perfectly still, her hands resting on her keyboard. She was looking at her central monitor. The angry red band of the enemy's assault frequency was gone. The spectrogram showed only the gentle, rolling blue-green waves of natural seismic activity. On another screen, a satellite feed, miraculously restored now that the intense, localized interference had ceased, was updating. It showed the valley on the north side of the mountain, or rather, where the valley used to be. The image was stark and absolute. The massive rock shelf she had targeted was gone from the mountain's face. In its place was a colossal, fresh scar of raw granite. The valley below, the narrow pass where the enemy assault force and their seismic emitters had been positioned, was now filled, buried under 100 meters of shattered rock. There was nothing left, no movement, no heat signatures, no signals, just the quiet, final stillness of a tomb. She had not just defeated the enemy, she had erased them from the map. The checkmate was absolute. Her solution had not been an act of brute force, but of intellect, a surgical strike using the enemy's own power against them. It was an unconventional triumph that left no room for doubt or interpretation. Slowly, Sergeant Rostova rose from her chair. She walked across the debris-strewn floor and stopped beside Thorne's workstation. She looked from the satellite image of the buried valley to Thorne's calm, impassive face. She didn't offer praise or congratulations. The moment felt too sacred for that. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered. "What were they?" she asked, her voice hushed with awe. "A new variable," Thorne answered, her gaze still on the screen. "One that has now been accounted for." She began typing again, her fingers moving with the same dispassionate precision as before. She was already collating the data from the event, analyzing the weapon's signature, the mountain's response, and the effectiveness of her countermeasure. For her, the crisis was over, and the analysis had begun. The moment of action had passed. It was now just another data point in a larger equation. It was then that the comm system, sputtering back to life, chirped. It was not a local channel. It was a quantum-entangled link, a direct, instantaneous connection to high command, a channel reserved for the gravest of emergencies. A single, crisp, male voice filled the room, cutting through the awed silence. Karst 7, this is General Marcus Thorne. Report status. We registered a seismic event that dwarfed every model we have. What in God's name happened down there? The name hung in the air, electric and impossible. Thorne. Valerius, who had managed to pull himself back into a chair on the dais, looked up, his face a mask of dawning horror. He finally understood. Before anyone could respond, Eris Thorne reached over and keyed the main comms panel herself. She did not stand. She did not salute an unseen superior. She spoke to the general as an equal. The new asset was deployed against us, Father, she said, her voice betraying no emotion. They used a brute force resonance attack. Their methods were imprecise. I was forced to use the local environment to effect a kinetic countermeasure. The threat has been neutralized. The base is secure, though in need of repair. I am transmitting the full data packet on their weapon signature now. Father. The word landed in the command center with the force of a physical blow. The quiet, unassuming civilian, the academic that Valerius had bullied and dismissed, was the daughter of the head of strategic command. But it was more than that. The general's next words erased any lingering doubt about the true power structure that had been at play all along. The general's voice came back, the professional anxiety replaced by a deep personal concern that was far more damning for Valerius. Eris, are you all right? They weren't supposed to have that technology in this theater. I never should have approved your deployment to such an exposed position. The exposure was the point, she replied, coolly. We needed to provoke them into showing their hand. They have. The data I've collected from this single event will advance the acoustic dominance program by 5 years. The risk was calculated and acceptable. Acoustic dominance program. The name was spoken of only in whispers in the highest echelons of intelligence. It was a theoretical weapons project, a ghost program aimed at turning geology itself into a controllable weapon. It was considered the holy grail of next-generation warfare. And Eris Thorne was not just a part of it. It was clear from her tone, from the general's deference, that she was its architect. The legendary, anonymous figure known to high command only by the code name Echo was sitting in their midst, wearing plain gray fatigues. The general was silent for a moment, processing the implications. Then his voice returned, cold and hard as diamond. Major Valerius, you are still the ranking officer on site. Give me your report. Valerius staggered to his feet. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. What could he possibly say? That he had ignored the warnings? That he had tried to stop the one person who could save them? That he had physically assaulted the single most valuable, strategic mind in the entire military? He was a dead man walking. His career was over. His reputation was a crater. He had not just failed. He had actively worked to ensure failure, blinded by his own arrogance and insecurity. He finally managed to speak, his voice a choked, broken whisper. Sir, there was a geological event. Dr. Thorne, she stopped it. It was a pathetic, inadequate summary, a confession of his own total irrelevance. "I have her report, Major." The general's voice was glacial. "It includes a full audio-visual log from the command center. It documents your performance in detail. You are hereby relieved of command, effective immediately. You will be confined to your quarters, pending a full court-martial. Sergeant Rostova, you are in temporary command of Karst 7 until a replacement arrives. Your only priority is to give Dr. Thorne anything and everything she requires. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Rostova breathed, her eyes wide. "Crystal clear, sir," Valerius mumbled, his shoulders slumping in utter defeat. The formal hierarchy had been shattered and then rebuilt, forged in the crucible of the crisis, now aligning perfectly with the demonstrated hierarchy of competence. The reckoning was complete. The comms link closed, leaving another profound silence in its wake. Valerius stood for a moment, a hollowed-out man, then turned and walked stiffly from the command center, his every step an admission of his disgrace. No one watched him go. Their attention, their awe, their complete and undivided focus was on the quiet woman in the corner. A new order had been established. The quiet, analytical hum of competence had replaced the loud, empty bluster of authority. In the hours that followed, the base began to slowly come back to life under Rostova's efficient command. Repair crews moved with a quiet purpose, their voices low, their movements respectful whenever they passed Thorne's alcove. She was no longer an outsider. She was the source, the reason they were still breathing the thick, recycled air. She paid them no mind, her focus entirely on the streams of data flowing across her screens. She showed no pride in her victory, no satisfaction in Valerius's downfall. The events were merely data points, the outcome a logical conclusion. Late in the next shift cycle, after primary power had been restored and a semblance of normalcy had returned, Sergeant Rostova approached the alcove. She held 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She placed one on the edge of Thorne's desk, careful not to disturb her work. Thorne glanced at it, then up at Rostova. It was the first time anyone had offered her such a simple, human gesture. It was not praise. It was not a request. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet sign of respect from one professional to another. It was a signal that the lesson had been learned. Thorne gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She took the mug, the warmth a strange, grounding sensation. Rostova stood for a moment, then gestured to the main seismic display, now calm and blue. "The mountain," she said quietly. "How did you know, not just that you could do it, but that it would work so perfectly?" Thorne took a sip of the coffee. She considered the question, not as a query about her actions, but as a technical inquiry. "The enemy saw the mountain as a wall," she finally said, her voice low. "A solid object to be broken. They were wrong. A mountain is not a wall. It is a bell. They were striking it with a hammer, trying to shatter it. I just listened for its resonant frequency. I found the one clear note it wanted to sing, and then I helped it sing." With that, she turned back to her work, the conversation over. Rostova watched her for another moment, then nodded to herself and walked away, the answer echoing in her mind. 3 days later, a special transport shuttle descended into the newly cleared landing zone. Dr. Eris Thorne departed as quietly as she had arrived. She carried a single data case containing the complete analysis of the event. She spoke to no one, her gray fatigues blending into the gray rock of the mountainside. The crew of Karst 7 watched her leave from the observation ports, their faces filled with an awe that would curdle into legend. She left behind a disgraced major, a newly promoted sergeant, and a crew that now understood that the most powerful weapon is not the one that makes the most noise, but the one that understands the silence. She was a ghost, a whisper in the stone. She came not to lead, but to solve. She did not seek authority, but became its natural center of gravity in a world torn apart. She had faced a man who believed power came from a badge, and an enemy who believed it came from brute force, and she had taught them both that true power lies in understanding the deep, hidden structures of the world. She left the mountain quieter than she found it, its one terrible song having been sung, its secrets now hers alone. Her legacy would not be written in commendations or history books, but in the lingering silence of the deep places, and in the quiet, unshakable respect of those who had witnessed the day a woman had spoken to a mountain, and the mountain had answered.